All right, let's talk about body composition real quick. In order to do that, we've got to consider our weight. And really, we want to know what's our ideal weight. That's what we're shooting for with body composition. What is making up our total weight? Is the majority of our weight coming from fat? Is it coming from muscle? How much influence does bone have on our weight? How much influence does water have on our weight? Not all field tests will require you to take weight, but you should, because we want to have that body composition measurement and compare it to our weight. It gives us a good idea of what's changing over time. So if we notice, here's a good example. If you take girth measurements, like waist to hip, and you notice your waist to hip numbers go down, but your weight stays the same or goes up, that could be an indication that you're losing fat but gaining muscle. So we need to have a weight measurement, even if it's not required to get our number. We need that comparison between whatever measurement we're taking and what's happening with our weight, because it can give us an idea. Even if we don't get a direct number on muscle mass, it can give us an idea. And it could be water weight, but at least we have an idea that, hey, we are dropping fat because our waist measurements have gone down, our hip measurements gone down, our weight stayed the same, or our weight went up. Something is changing, and we know that fat is going down. So BMI is not good for most people. And so for me, it tells me I'm in grade 1 obesity. So I have 7% body fat. Obviously, I'm not in grade 1 obesity. That's the reason you can't trust BMI. It's not good for people that are short in stature, people that are under the age of 18, people that work out. So it's not good for the majority of the population. It's only really used typically for people that don't work out at all, that are just starting and need an idea. But for the average person, it's not really good. If you do any kind of training at all, you're going to have more lean muscle mass than the average person. If you do any resistance training, your bones are going to be thicker than the average person's. All of that is going to factor in to your BMI. So that's why I tell most people, don't trust your BMI. I can have a percent body fat that is almost excessively low and a BMI that tells me I'm in grade 1 obesity. So you always want to trust the percent body fat, not the BMI. So how does bioelectrical impedance work? So this is a different type of measurement. If you've ever seen like a Tanita Scale where you step up on it, it runs an electrical signal through your body. Fat is going to impede the signal. So you notice bioelectrical, so we're running the electricity through the body. Fat is going to impede the signal. That's where the impedance word comes from. So we're getting resistance. It's going to impede the signal. Fat is hydrophobic, right? So there's no way for it to really be conducted, the electricity to be conducted through the fat, whereas muscle is hydrated and the signal can go through muscle. So it gives us an idea of lean mass. It can give us an idea of our percent body fat. It can give us an idea of our hydration level, if we're adequately hydrated. And if we're not, we can't trust the numbers on bioelectrical impedance. So if you step up on the scale and you see that you're below 50%, most of them will tell you that that's outside your area of hydration. It'll give you a range, like anywhere between 50% of your weight is coming from water all the way up to 60%. And it may vary depending on the machine. But the idea there is if you're dehydrated, you can't trust the signal because you're not going to have enough hydration for muscle to conduct the signal at the speed it would be if you were adequately hydrated. All right, so now let's talk about percent body fat. So you have subcutaneous fat right underneath the skin. This is normally measured several different ways. You can do it with calipers, you can do it with a body pod, you can do it with hydrostatic weighing, you can do it with a DEXA scan, you can do it with a Tanita machine, with bioelectrical impedance. All of these will give you percent body fat. That is a good number to use instead of BMI. You can trust that. It gives you a good idea of how much fat you have on your body. So that's what I would look at if you can do that one. Now, not all of you will have access to a field test that can do percent body fat, so you may have to do girth measurements, and that's the reason I have that on the pre-test, because that's something you can do at home with a measuring tape. Just make sure you also weigh yourself. Then you have body fat mass. How much of your total weight is coming from fat? That's what, if you ever get a body fat mass number, how that differs between percent body fat. This is the percentage of fat on your body, and body fat mass is factored into your weight. How much of your weight is coming from fat? So that excludes your lean mass, and it's going to exclude water, muscle, and bone. This is just fat. How much of your weight comes from fat? And then you have a body fat range, and this will vary depending on the field test. Right now, I have subcutaneous measurements up here, so that means you're doing this with skinfold measurements. If you do this with the Tanita machine, the ranges actually increase by about 3 to 5% for men, 3 to 5% for women, depending on the machine. So if you look in your textbook, they're going to give you subcutaneous ranges because they've been out longer. These Tanita machines have been out for a while, but typically you won't see it in a textbook where they give you the ranges for it. So right now, let's just discuss these based on caliper measurements. So for men, you want to be between 5 and 25. If you're under 5%, you don't have a lot of body fat to tap into, so if you get sick, your body's going to go after muscle. If you're over 25%, you run the risk of hypokinetic disease. So that just means low movement. You're not moving around enough and you're starting to gain weight. So things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, all of those will be considered hypokinetic diseases, and even some cancers. So for women, depends on the textbook. Some will say 9, some will say 12. They all pretty much cap out at 30 for subcutaneous body fat. So that's the fat right underneath your skin. And I just went with the lower range because you will see that in some textbooks. So if you drop below that, you're in the unhealthy range. You just don't have enough fat to tap into. And the same thing, your body will go after muscle, and it can hurt your metabolism. Whereas if you're over, again, you run the risk of having hypokinetic diseases, especially if you keep that fat on your body for a long period of time, and especially if it's visceral fat. If you can find out where you're storing your fat, that's extremely important. So anything over 25 is considered obese for men, anything over 30 for women. And again, I want to stress these are subcutaneous ranges. They're not including visceral fat. So this is not something like bioelectrical impedance. This is just with caliper measurements. So here's your Tanita Scale, and it gives you an age range. So 20 to 39, you're looking at around 21%, somewhere roughly around there in that healthy range, and then all the way up to around 33. That's why I was saying these are adjusted compared to the and that this is for women. I'm talking about numbers for women right now. This will vary plus or minus 2 compared to the skinfold calipers. So it just really depends on the machine. It depends on your age range. Notice as we age, our healthy range for fat actually goes up because we actually have more fat on our body because we start to lose muscle mass and our metabolism slows down. So we're having more fat. That's the reason this range changes, because we're going to have a little bit more on our body. And for men, you can see the healthy range is pretty close to what you're seeing with the skinfold calipers, plus or minus, really +3 there for men. So this is for Tanita machine, and it gives you under fat, healthy, over fat, and obese. Fat-free mass or lean mass. So this is everything except fat. So if you ever have a fat-free muscle or measurement, then they are talking about everything except fat. So that includes bone, muscle, and water. And you're typically going to see these measurements on a Tanita scale or a body pod. Hydrostatic weighing won't really give you that. DEXA scan will give you these numbers too as well, depending on the machine. So percent body water and body water mass. So how much of your weight is coming from water? This is a measurement of hydration, and this needs to be over 50% for most bioelectrical impedance machines for it to give you your true numbers. And then visceral fat rating. This is extremely important. So for most people, you want to be between 1 and 12%. Somewhere right around in there is a healthy range for visceral fat. This is fat around your internal organs. Having too much of it, there's a high risk for hypokinetic disease, especially heart disease. And so if we look here, when we're talking about visceral fat, it's the fat around the internal organs. So I've seen people just like this diagram here where you can pinch the subcutaneous fat and even see the muscle through the skin. So they have this big beer belly. You can see their ab muscles, but they have a beer belly. And so the fat is around the internal organs. So Chuck Liddell is a good example of this. When he was fighting, he even had a beer belly, and that was more visceral fat, the fat around the internal organs. And then you've got subcutaneous fat, the fat that you can pinch underneath skin. So muscle mass, just giving you the muscle. So this has an impact on your resting metabolic rate. And they'll give it to you as a basal metabolic rate sometimes, or sometimes as a resting metabolic rate. So resting metabolic rate is what's happening with me now. I'm just sitting still, I'm not working out. Basal metabolic rate is when you're asleep. So if they give you a BMR, that's not really a BMR, it's more of a RMR, resting metabolic rate. So it's all based on how much muscle mass you have. How many calories are you burning just sitting still? That would be resting metabolic rate. How many calories are you burning while you're asleep? That's a basal metabolic rate. Physique rating. So this is based on your activity level. So a Tanita machine will ask you this. How active are you? Because it needs to get an idea of if you're really active, it's going to put your numbers that it measures into a different formula. And if you're moderately active, there's a different formula. If you're a beginner, there's a different formula. If you're male or female, it puts it into a different formula. So just based on physique rating, you could get different numbers for the same person. So let's say you work out, but I say that you're a beginner, that you don't train very often. And then I do that measurement, and then I do another one based on your true activity level. They're going to be different because they went into two different formulas. So you need to make sure you have that right. So if you're working out 3 to 5 times a week, you would select high activity level. So basal metabolic rate, I talked about that. That's when you're asleep. It's really a resting metabolic rate that these machines are giving you. Basal is when you're asleep. And then bone mass. This is not a bone density test that these Tanita machines do. The bioelectrical impedance machines do not do bone mass. What it is everything that's not fat, that's not water, and muscle, whatever's left over, must be bone. And that's how they're getting it. That's how they're getting the measurement from your total weight. And then a skinfold test. So I normally do this in my face-to-face class. I teach them how to use the skinfold calipers. That's where you pinch different body sites based on men and women. Typically you'll do a 3-site reading. There's some that are 5, some that are 7. The more sites that you take and put those numbers that sum a skinfold into a chart, the more sites that you record from, the more accurate your reading is. But we do a 3-site because it just takes too long to do those other sites where you've got 5 or 7. So on guys, you take between up on the chest, about halfway between the deltoid and the nipple. That's where you would measure. And then you take another measurement an inch away from the navel, and then midways up on the thigh. So between the knee and the hip bone. And for ladies, back on the tricep, just above the superiliac crest, just above your hip bone, and then midways up on the thigh if you're doing the 3-site readings. And then we talked about these other measurements like hydrostatic weighing, body pod, DEXA scan. These really aren't field tests. You have to go to a lab to do these, or they have to have them in a truck like a mobile lab. But things like skinfold calipers, girth measurements, Tanita scales, those would all be considered field tests, where you could take them out into the field, measure people, and be good to go. So I'm going to try to keep this video as short as I can, and I will see you in the next video, which should be flexibility.